but also it involves potential forced labor, which there's been a lot of criticism of, a lot of proof of, particularly in the Xinjiang province, which allows labor costs to drop below even the very low standards that China already had into one where labor is essentially free. And quite frankly, if you see anybody stand up to the way the government operates on a daily basis, including journalists from around the world, which to date, there's 127 of them that are now currently jailed for speaking out in any sort of critical manner towards the government, you are immediately silenced. You're disappeared.
يطل العام الجديد على تحديات كثيرة تواجه التنين الصيني على المستويات الاقتصادية والأمنية والسياسية، وذلك جراء السياسات الخارجية العدوانية التي تنتهجها الصين في العالم. فالأخيرة وجراء عدوانيتها تعرض قوتها الاقتصادية العظمى للتآكل، ما يهدد استمرار نموها، حتى باتت عبارة أينما حلت الصين تحل الانتهاكات مقولة شائعة. فقد أقامت الجزر الصناعية في المناطق المتنازع عليها في بحر الصين الجنوبي، ومارست القهر الاقتصادي مع شركائها التجاريين مثل أستراليا، بالإضافة إلى الضغط الذي تمارسه على تيوان التي تعتبرها جزءا من أراضيها، ومعاداتها للدول التي تعترف بها كدولة سيدة. كما لم يعد خافيا على العالم الاستعمار المقنع الذي تفرضه الصين على القارة الأفريقية، محاولة بذلك استغلال مواردها وثرواتها وحتى بحارها. إلى ذلك يطيح ملف حقوق الإنسان بالصورة التي تحاول الصين تسويقها عن نفسها في العالم. ففي أعوام ما بعد مذبحة ميدان تيانمن في العام 1989 ضد المطالبين بالديمقراطية في الصين، أصبح القادة الصينيون مهتمين بنسبة بسيطة بالمعايير الغربية لحقوق الإنسان. أيضا أقلية الإيغور المسلمة تتعرض لانتهاكات جماعية في إقليم شينجيانغ من دون أي نية بوقف ذلك. فكيف تحولت الصين إلى قوة اقتصادية عظمى؟ وكيف ساهم الغرب في ذلك؟ وما هي التحديات التي تواجه الصين اليوم على المستوى الداخلي وكذلك الخارجي؟ بدأت العلاقات التجارية للغرب مع الصين في العام 1979 بحسب ما أوضح كاتب ومؤلف كتاب Feeding the Dragon وعضو اللجنة الوطنية للعلاقات بين الولايات المتحدة والصين ومجلس الشيوخ الخارجية والمسؤول الإعلامي للجنة كريس فانتون، وبذلك أتيح لها النمو الاقتصادي إلى أن تحولت اليوم إلى قوة عظمى. يوضح فانتون الأسباب الكامنة خلف رغبة الدول في العمل والتجارة مع الصين، ويعود ذلك بشكل أساسي إلى أنها شيوعية، وكان لديها نظام استبدادي أو شمولي إلى حد ما يعني أنه يمكن الحصول على يد عاملة رخيصة، بالإضافة إلى انخفاض كلفة إنتاج السلع والخدمات في الصين.
The fact that China has been able to bring down the costs of production through very cheap labor. So it wasn't only just getting products and services into that massive market, it was also exploring and activating ways to actually produce those products and services inside the market itself. And that allowed big profits and big revenues to occur for global companies around the world. Unfortunately, the way to get that cheap labor in a lot of instances is not only what we hear about when it comes to migrants coming into the big cities and working for very low wages and living in dormitories, but still under some sort of free life that allows them to go back and forth to their homeland outside of the big cities during the national holidays. But also it involves potential forced labor, which there's been a lot of criticism of, a lot of proof of, particularly in the Xinjiang province, which allows labor costs to drop below even the very low standards that China already had into one where labor is essentially free. And that is a real problem when it comes to companies, particularly here in the United States of America, that are under these ESG or social activism roles, where they are activists in terms of creating better dynamics when it comes to climate change or human rights or free speech issues, yet continue to operate with this type of forced labor in China.
استطاعت الحكومة الصينية تعزيز قوتها السياسية مع مرور الوقت، خصوصا في عهد شي جينبينغ. وبحسب ما يؤكد فانتون، ففي السابق كان هناك ما يصل إلى 9 أعضاء في اللجنة الدائمة أو حتى أكثر، ما يسمح بتأثير من قبل مجموعة أكبر من الناس. اليوم هناك 7 أعضاء في اللجنة الدائمة، وشي جينبينغ أحدهم، وقد كرس لنفسه القدرة على البقاء في السلطة طالما أراد ذلك، فهو يفرض الإملاءات أساسا على جميع أجزاء الحزب الشيوعي الصيني الذي يبلغ عددهم اليوم نحو 92 مليون شخص من بين 1.4 مليار شخص من إجمالي عدد السكان. وعلى الرغم من تحول الصين إلى قوة اقتصادية، فنظامها السياسي بقي شموليا، فهي تستمر بفرض قيودها على حرية الرأي والتعبير.
The way to rise up through the Communist Party is obviously in the bottom ranks of the local and regional, provincial and municipal governments, where you're doing the duties that are dictated by the Chinese Communist Party during their annual meetings. And the more that you do that, the more that you rise. But the more that you rise under the tutelage and the influence of the particular members that are under that have the most control over the country. So you are seeing something that has been considered communist, or communist with Chinese characteristics, or socialist with Chinese characteristics, but one that has gotten actually much more totalitarian in its rule. And quite frankly, if you see anybody stand up to the way the government operates on a daily basis, including journalists from around the world, which to date, there's 127 of them that are now currently jailed for speaking out in any sort of critical manner towards the government, you are immediately silenced. You're disappeared. We've seen this with Peng Shui. We've seen this with Fan Bingbing when it comes to the cultural side of things. And we've also seen it in various instances of other critics, artists, journalists, politicians, leaders, whether on the local level or on the national level. It is a very, very strong and strict leadership that has essentially strengthened its control over time.
وبما أن التعبير عن الرأي غير مرحب به في الصين، فإن المعارضة الداخلية غير مضمونة ولا مرحب بها على الإطلاق بحسب فانتون، سواء أكان في الماضي أم في الحاضر. لذلك يتم التخلص منها على الفور، وقد رأينا ذلك في حالات اختفاء عديدة وكثيرة على مدى العقود القليلة الماضية، وذلك شيء يستمر ويبدو أنه في تسارع. وإلى جانب قمع الحريات والتعبير عن الرأي، يسعى شي جينبينغ إلى إخماد فكرة الرأسمالية بالشكل المعروف في الغرب.
Well, the main elements that she likes to or is trying to tamp down is the idea of capitalism in the form that the West enjoys, this free market capitalism that's creating certain entities that are becoming questionably more powerful than the state itself. We saw this with Alibaba, where the strength and the reach of the populace from Alibaba, whether it was through their platforms in media or whether even through their financial services with Ant, got so powerful that Xi Jinping said, hey, enough is enough. We're going to crack down on this. We've also seen capitalism influence lots of things that he considers are rackets. And it's arguable whether he's correct or not. But the rackets create a divide between the have and the have-nots. And remember, he needs to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. There's simply not enough resources on earth to make them all happy. So he has got to provide them all of what they need and some of what they want in this belief that they can rise up to get more of what they want if they do things right under the guise of the Chinese Communist Party. One of the things that creates that ability to block that aspiration of the underclass is when rackets occur that essentially privilege the upper class and create massive obstacles for the lower class. And we saw this in the tutoring business, which has really been funded by huge capitalist instincts to take advantage of the rich wanting to send their kids to the best schools in the world. But that prevents the lower class from being able to compete at the same level to get into the best schools in the world. So we've seen Xi Jinping come in and put the kibosh on anything that has to do with the tutoring business. So if you look at what threatens his power, it really comes down to unrest among 1.4 billion people and unrest among a majority of that 1.4 billion people. So he is looking to put the end to any sort of criticism of the competence of the government, while also creating this idea that anybody can rise and that there's a true equality that is under the tutelage of the Chinese Communist Party that allows anyone to achieve what they want to achieve, and there are no favorites given.
تسعى المعارضة داخل الحزب الشيوعي الصيني إلى الإفادة مما توفره الرأسمالية لزيادة ثروتها، ويشكل ذلك تحديا للتشي. فمن الواضح بحسب فينتون أن المعارضة داخل الحزب تميل إلى التركيز على مصلحتها الذاتية، وعندما يتعلق الأمر بالرأسمالية يشكل ذلك أحد المكونات الرئيسية التي تشكل عقبة لتشي جينبينغ.
The dissent inside the party is obviously one that tends to focus on whether it's self-interest when it comes to capitalism. That's one of the key ingredients that I think we're seeing Xi Jinping hit obstacles on. For instance, Hong Kong or even Macau has been a fantastic way for the Chinese Communist Party leaders to make money in the world of capitalism. There's a lot of free trade and free banking sort of apparatuses when it comes to the old sort of pre-2020 version of Hong Kong. And that was really clamped down on. Macau is another special administrative region where Chinese Communist Party leaders had access to offshoring RMB or yuan to other places around the world through the gaming system, the casino system in Macau. Xi Jinping has now cracked down on that. So if you look at the self-interest of certain leaders that have capitalistic drive, they are definitely butting heads with the new Xi Jinping, this idea of common prosperity, this idea of everybody in the same boat. That is something that does not mix well with those who have believed that they have achieved this ability to do things that others can't.
أما في موضوع إدارة الثروات من قبل المجموعة الحاكمة في الصين، وما إذا كانت تنفق المال على مصالحها وعلى أسرها وشركائها ولمنفعتها الذاتية، قال فانتون:
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be extremely helpful when it comes to governments around the world trying to track this. I can tell you sort of on a top layer, the goal was always to try to get as much RMB out of the country as possible, convert it to dollars, and hold assets offshore. So you saw a lot of structures and entities formed, whether it was in the Cayman Islands or in Malta or in Dutch companies or in various other places around the world, where if the RMB was moved into Macau and out of Macau, or into Hong Kong and out of Hong Kong, they could then use that conversion into dollars worldwide to buy assets. And as we saw with particular businesses like, say, Dailan Wanda Group, which up till about 2016 was using that offshore currency, that ability to get money offshore to buy things in Hollywood, such as Legendary Entertainment, which makes the the Pacific Rim franchises, the Godzilla franchises. Also, they bought AMC theaters. They bought Carmike theaters, which allowed Wanda to become the largest theatrical group in the United States of America, and a very strong grip when it came to European theaters too. We saw them buy soccer teams. We saw them buy various buildings. So that ability to get money offshore for particular people that had a certain privilege inside of China was then translating into assets around the world that they could hold and essentially create the security for both them and their families.
من الواضح مؤخرا وبعد جملة القرارات الاقتصادية المتخذة في الصين أن ثمة تشددا على الطفرات العقارية التي تغذيها الديون والتي تسببت بسقوط شركة إيفرغراند. يتخذ تشي جينبينغ تكتيكا مثيرا للاهتمام عندما يتعلق الأمر بإيفرغراند، فالشركة تتأرجح نحو الإفلاس وتفقد قدرتها على تمويل ديونها ومدفوعات السندات، وهو ما يسمح لها بالفشل، وذلك أمر لم تعتد عليه النخبة في الصين، إذ أنهم اعتادوا على أن يتم إنقاذهم من قبل بنك الشعب الصيني، وعلى أن يقوم البنك المركزي الصيني والجهات الحكومية بتجنب الانهيار في النظام الاقتصادي.
Remember, Xi Jinping wants to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. One way to sort of go opposite when that agenda is in play is to make people fearful that the economic system is collapsing. So every time a company would start to fail, including Dailan Wanda, which had real issues, the government would come in and essentially save the bondholders, save the equity holders, save a lot of the elite class that was making money through reckless investment, through speculation, through debt-fueled growth. They were saving them, at the same token, rewarding them during the good times. And that was a real problem in Xi Jinping's eyes. So now he wants to see those investors that took risk pay the price of that risk, while also trying to showcase that the economic system is stable, while also helping those with little means crawl out of any sort of hole that they have in regards to the investments that they incurred through these companies. Like, for instance, Evergrande, there are projects around the country that average lower class, middle class people might have investments in. Xi Jinping wants to make sure those people end up okay, while making sure the top level that were the most reckless, the most speculative, and the most, essentially ignoring of the massive risks they were taking, make sure they pay the price. And that is the issue that he's seen internally, because a lot of those very people he wants to be penalized for the reckless investment that they had are also people very high up in the government.
يتحدث كثر عن فقدان جينبينغ السلطة، غير أن فنتون يقول عكس ذلك، إذ يرى أنه يكتسب السلطة والنفوذ داخل البلاد في الوقت الحالي، كما لا يرى أن ذلك سينتهي في أي وقت قريب، إذ أن قوة التأثير التي اكتسبها خلال فترة ولايته تزيده شجاعة، لكن يمكن أن يكون هناك قضايا جيوسياسية تسبب له مشاكل كبيرة عندما يتعلق الأمر بالعلاقات العامة للصين وصورتها، كما حصل في قضية اختفاء لاعبة التنس الصينية بينغ شوي إلى الكثير من قضايا حقوق الإنسان في مقاطعة شينجيانغ، إلى حقيقة أن هناك قطيعة دبلوماسية بالنسبة للألعاب الأولمبية القادمة في فبراير، وتلك مشكلة كبيرة بالنسبة للصين.
Remember, China isn't necessarily all about winning gold medals, because they won't win a lot of gold medals when it comes to the Winter Olympics. And they're not even all that pressured to have huge amounts of fans come to those Olympics, because obviously of COVID and so on. What they do want is that validation of world leaders around the world of what they've accomplished over the last 40 years and the superpower they've become. So that diplomatic boycott from the 5 or 6 countries so far and more that will join is a real face problem for them. And they need to contain that, so only the outside's really paying attention to it. And the internal politics and narrative are essentially keeping the populace from understanding what's going on that geopolitical level.
ثمة قضية كبيرة أخرى يقول فانتون أنه لابد من لفت الانتباه إليها، وهي تايوان. فالأخيرة، ومن خلال TSMC شركة تيوان لصناعة أشباه الموصلات، تشكل المنتج الرئيسي لأشباه الموصلات التي تستخدم في المنتجات والخدمات في كل أنحاء العالم. ويعتقد فانتون أنهم يملكون حصة في السوق بنسبة 65% من ذلك الإنتاج، وكانت الصين متحمسة لذلك ولفكرة أنها ستسيطر على تايوان في المستقبل القريب. والسؤال هو متى وكيف سيحدث ذلك؟ هل سيبادر العالم إلى حل المشكلة وفرض التراجع على الصين والدفاع عن تايوان التي يعتبر كثر أنها دولة مستقلة ذات سيادة، في حين أن الصين تعتبرها جزءا من أراضيها؟